Xi Jinping is watching Vladimir Putin make every mistake in the authoritarian playbook, and he's taking careful notes to ensure China doesn't repeat them when Beijing finally moves on Taiwan. While Putin burns through Russia's military and economy in a disastrous war of choice, Xi is methodically preparing for a conflict he believes he can win without firing a shot. The difference in their approaches reveals everything about why China poses a far more sophisticated and dangerous threat than Russia ever could. Putin has thrown away the most important rule that kept the Soviet Union competitive for decades: never fight hot wars. Every Soviet leader from Stalin through Brezhnev understood that direct military confrontation was unpredictable, expensive, and likely to backfire. They preferred proxy conflicts where they could bleed their enemies without risking their own core interests. But Putin has built his entire political career on the opposite approach: direct military intervention that has now culminated in the catastrophic invasion of Ukraine. Xi is watching this unfold with a mixture of horror and satisfaction because Putin's failures are teaching him exactly how not to handle Taiwan. When I analyze China's strategic behavior over the past decade, I see a careful campaign to avoid every trap that has ensnared Russia. Where Putin uses crude military force, China deploys economic coercion, cyber warfare, and information operations. Where Russia alienates potential allies through aggression, China builds economic dependencies that make resistance costly. Where Putin acts impulsively based on emotional grievances, Xi plans methodically for long-term advantage. This isn't coincidence, it's the result of China's systematic study of Russian failures and determination not to repeat them. The Soviet Union's leaders were all veterans of World War II through Leonid Brezhnev, and they understood that war is easy to get into, but hard to get out of, and extremely unpredictable in its consequences. This is why they loved it when the United States got bogged down in hot wars like Korea and Vietnam, watching Americans tear each other apart while Russia stayed safely on the sidelines. The Soviets stayed out of direct confrontation until after Brezhnev's stroke, when Yuri Andropov pushed for the disastrous invasion of Afghanistan against the advice of the Soviet military. That mistake cost them dearly when the United States provided Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen and turned Afghanistan into a bleeding wound that helped bring down the entire Soviet system. Putin seems to have learned nothing from this history. He has risen to power on a diet of hot wars, starting with the Second Chechen War, where he leveled Grozny and turned most of Chechnya into an environmental wasteland. Then came the war with Georgia in 2008, where he detached South Ossetia and Abkhazia while the world was distracted by the Olympics. When he faced domestic unrest after eliminating term limits in 2012, he solved the problem by seizing Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014, walking off with 7% of Ukrainian territory at seemingly low cost. Each success emboldened him to take bigger risks, culminating in the 2022 invasion that has become a strategic disaster for Russia. Xi has been watching this pattern with growing alarm, not because he opposes Russian aggression, but because he sees how counterproductive it has become. China's approach to Taiwan and the South China Sea follows a completely different template, one designed to achieve the same goals as Putin without making the same catastrophic errors. Instead of sending tanks across borders, China uses economic leverage to make resistance economically ruinous for its targets. Instead of crude military threats, Beijing employs gray zone operations that stay below the threshold of war while steadily advancing Chinese positions. Where Russia isolates itself through obvious aggression, China maintains plausible deniability while systematically changing facts on the ground. Consider how differently China and Russia approach their territorial ambitions. Putin demanded that NATO withdraw from all territories that joined after 1997, an impossible demand that united the entire Western alliance against Russia. Xi makes no such dramatic ultimatums about Taiwan. Instead, China gradually increases military pressure, economic integration, and international isolation of Taiwan, while maintaining that peaceful reunification remains the preferred option. Putin invaded Ukraine with insufficient forces and unclear objectives, creating a grinding war of attrition that has devastated the Russian military and economy. China has spent years building up overwhelming force advantages around Taiwan while developing economic and political weapons that could bring the island to its knees without a shot being fired. The difference in sophistication is staggering. Putin acts like a crude 19th century imperialist, seizing territory through naked aggression and then acting surprised when the entire world turns against him. Xi operates like a master strategist, using every tool available to advance Chinese interests while maintaining maximum flexibility and minimum risk. This is why China poses a far more serious long-term threat to global stability than Russia ever could. Where Russia's approach alienates potential allies and strengthens opposing coalitions, China's strategy is specifically designed to divide and weaken resistance while building Chinese advantages across multiple domains simultaneously. Putin's mistakes have handed Xi a roadmap of exactly what not to do when the time comes to move on Taiwan. First, don't launch an invasion unless you're absolutely certain you can achieve decisive victory quickly. The longer a conflict drags on, the more time adversaries have to organize effective resistance and impose crippling costs. Putin clearly thought Ukraine would collapse within days, but when that didn't happen, he had no viable exit strategy. Xi has no intention of making the same error. If China moves on Taiwan, it will be with overwhelming force designed to present the world with a fait accompli before effective resistance can be organized. Second, don't underestimate the economic costs of international isolation. Putin assumed that Europe's dependence on Russian energy would prevent serious sanctions, but he miscalculated how quickly Western countries would be willing to bear economic costs to oppose Russian aggression. Xi is working systematically to make the global economy so dependent on China that opposing Beijing would be economically ruinous for everyone involved. Where Russia represents perhaps 2% of global GDP, China represents nearly 20% and is integrated into virtually every supply chain that matters. Third, don't give opponents time to organize effective military assistance. Putin's slow buildup before the Ukraine invasion telegraphed his intentions and gave NATO months to prepare defensive measures and plan military assistance. Xi is likely to move much faster if he decides that military action is necessary, using China's massive missile arsenal and overwhelming local force advantages to paralyze Taiwan before outside help can arrive. Fourth, maintain political warfare advantages throughout any conflict. Putin's invasion united Ukrainian society against Russia and turned Vladimir Zelensky into an international hero. Xi's approach to Taiwan is designed to exploit political divisions within Taiwan and between Taiwan and its potential allies, making unified resistance much more difficult to achieve and sustain. Fifth, never commit to a course of action that requires you to escalate indefinitely to avoid defeat. Putin's invasion has become an existential struggle for his regime. He cannot afford to lose, but he also cannot afford to keep fighting indefinitely. This gives his opponents enormous leverage because they know he is trapped in an unsustainable position. Xi's strategy is designed to create multiple exit ramps that allow China to declare victory and de-escalate before reaching the point of no return. The most chilling aspect of Xi's approach is how it learns from every Russian failure while maintaining the same fundamental goal of imperial expansion. China wants to dominate Asia just as much as Russia wants to dominate Eastern Europe, but Beijing is pursuing these goals with far greater sophistication and strategic patience. Where Putin has alienated virtually everyone through crude aggression, Xi is building a coalition of dependence that makes opposition to China economically suicidal for most countries. Where Russia burns through its military and economic resources in a futile war, China methodically builds overwhelming advantages across every domain that matters. The tragedy is that Putin's failures may actually make Chinese aggression more likely, not less. Xi is learning that the international community's appetite for sustained resistance is limited, that economic costs ultimately matter more than principles for most governments, and that fait accompli strategies can work if executed properly. Putin's crude approach failed, but a more sophisticated version might succeed where Russia could not. This is why understanding the differences between Russian and Chinese strategies is so crucial for anyone trying to prevent the next major international crisis. Putin's invasion of Ukraine may ultimately prove to be a dress rehearsal for something far more dangerous, a Chinese move on Taiwan that applies all the lessons Putin failed to learn. The question is whether the rest of us are learning those lessons too and preparing accordingly. The stakes couldn't be higher, because unlike Russia, China actually has the economic, technological, and military resources to reshape the international order if its strategy succeeds. We must be ready.